Welcome everyone to the NCFCA 2023 Policy Resolutions Live Q&A. Feel free to go ahead and leave on your cameras if you'd like, but please mute your microphones. And when we get to questions, you can ask those questions by typing in the chat box and we will get your questions live. So as you can see, I have several members of the debate committee here with me this evening. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute. They're here to answer all of your questions that you have about our proposed policy resolutions. So whether you're here live or you're watching later online, we welcome you and trust that you will gain the information that you need to decide which policy resolution you want to debate next year. I'm Christy Scheib. I'll be your host this evening. I've been involved with NCFCA debate from the very beginning and have been a longtime member of the debate committee. I'm also an NCFCA mom. You can probably see one of my alumni children here. And I have 5 kids. 4 of them are alumni who've been in NCFCA and 1 current competitor who's doing TP actually this year. And now I'd like to invite the other committee members to introduce themselves to you. Tell your name, a little bit about your family, your connection to NCFCA. And if you want to throw in a fun fact about yourself, feel free. Let me start with Cheryl.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Edwards, and I'm an alumni parent and a current coach. This is my 10th year in the league and my 7th year coaching. And I do coach both team policy and moot court. And I guess the thing that students find the most amusing about me is that I've been a long time Weird Al Yankovic fan.
Ah, okay. I love it. All right, let's come to you, Emma.
Hello, I'm Emma Scheib. I'm connected to NCFCA because my mom was part of starting NCFCA, and I competed in team policy for many years. It was my favorite event. And I guess a fun fact about me, though, is despite loving TP above LD, I'm going to school for philosophy. I really do enjoy philosophy.
Great, thank you, Emma. And a person that you debated while you were in the league, Jonathan, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Sure. My name is Jonathan Monroe. I'm a former NCFCA alum, competed about 3 years down here in Region 9, I think 2 up in Region 10 here. My brother and I were team policy partners the last 2 years, and we actually worked with Christy on a few projects, a few coaching efforts as well. So she got the chance to see Joel and I stumble not only through debate prep, but also through piano lessons as well.
That's right. Fun fact. We're so excited you're here.
Well, one quick addendum to the family side. I'm actually going to be getting married at the end of this month here. So I'm getting married to another NCFCA alumni, Emily Boyles.
Oh yes, Emily. Yes, congratulations. That's so exciting.
Thank you.
The NCFCA brings people together, right?
And if I have to pick a fun fact, I once cited myself in a school paper.
Okay. Oh, that's hilarious. All right, well, we are going to get to your questions in just a minute. But first, I'd like to explain a little bit about the process of how we select these resolutions for your vote. So we collect emails actually from you, the affiliates, all through the year. So you can start thinking about ideas even for next year if you'd like, and emailing the debate committee. We gather all of those ideas. The members of the committee also brainstorm and come up with ideas. So we start with this big list of potential topics. And then the committee reviews, researches, discusses, debates amongst ourselves, all the proposals, and narrows it down to their top 3. And those top 3 are resolutions that the committee feels really good about. Like any of these 3 would be great, great debate topics for you for the season. We use some criteria as we narrow those topics down, and I want to run through those. There are 6 criteria that we use to narrow down those topics. The first and the most important is mission compatibility. As you know, we are a Christian speech and debate league, and so we want to choose topics that will advance our mission, something that Christians can debate in good conscience, And that is always our number one criteria that we use. Secondly, we're looking for something with high educational value. And that kind of goes along with our third criteria of relevance. So something that's going to give you a really important issue to examine, and also an issue, a topic area that's going to be very relevant for the next foreseeable years, maybe even decades. As you are growing up and going into the adult world, you're going to say, wow, I'm so glad I studied that topic while I was in high school and NCFCA. It's coming really in handy now as I am in my career, or even just as you are a citizen of our country and making decisions for the future. So we want the topic to be educational and relevant. The fourth criteria that we look at is the breadth. We want something that is broad enough that there's going to be a good case variety and something that can last us through a whole season, right? So that it's not going to be so narrow that we've heard all the cases in a couple of months of debate, but something that gives us some, some broadness without being too broad. And we'll discuss a little bit later how broad these resolutions are and kind of the committee's assessment of each one and how much breadth there is there. The fifth criteria is supportability. We're looking for topics that have a good amount of literature and articles and journals and things that you can go and use for research. We don't want to pick something so obscure that you have difficulty finding evidence and information on that topic. And finally, we look at variety. We want to give you a good choice of different types of topic areas, maybe something that in your high school career, you get a nice selection of topics over that 4, or even sometimes competitors are in for 6 or 7 years, that we don't repeat topics. And if you watched my preview for these policy resolutions this year, each one of them is a brand new topic area for policy debate. So I think that this committee has really hit the mark on giving you a good variety this year. So that's how we narrow them down to those top 3. And then we release those 3, which we just have done with white papers. You are looking at the white paper authors right here. They're going to be talking about their resolutions and the research that they have done on that with you tonight. And that brings us to tonight. We're here to answer your questions. And then, of course, you are the ones who are going to vote and select which resolution to pick. I'll talk about at the end of this evening how to go to your account on NCFCA website and vote and all of that. We'll give those details at the end. But now we want to get to your questions. First of all, I just want to say, if you have questions about debate in general, about rules or what's allowed or protocols or theory, this is not the forum for those questions. You can ask your questions to the debate committee by emailing debatecommittee@ncfca.org. Also, if you have wording suggestions for tweaking the topics that we have now, the wording is not finalized until after the voting, and then we have even a grace period after that where we just leave it for a little while before we finalize the wording. So if you have wording suggestions in particular, that's something else that we won't really be discussing here tonight. So feel free again to email the debate committee at ncfca.org for those suggestions. So that brings us to policy resolution number 1. And Jonathan Monroe is going to be covering the questions for that resolution. I'll just read that language. The wording is: the United States federal government should significantly reform its policies regarding international research collaboration. So let me start off, Jonathan, by asking, what are the key issues at the heart of this resolution?
Well, when it comes down to most of the research efforts being undertaken today, there's collaboration with other nations helps drive and build ingenuity. So that way there's further advancements of technology. We want a way that we can safely work with other nations to enhance our own technological prowess, build on the advancements that they're using without opening national security issues. but it also is a double-edged sword, because while we want to protect national security, protect state secrets, you don't want to stifle creativity. You don't want to stifle that same development.
Right, exactly. All right. I just want to remind our audience that feel free to ask your questions in the chat about this resolution. As the committee was researching this resolution, did you find a good body of literature on this topic? Is it something that's out there being discussed today?
Yes, there's several different groups that have analyzed this type of material, and even governmental agencies have considered various policy implications of research collaboration. Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services, just to name a few. The Council on Governmental Relations is also another one that has done some assessment of how do we essentially head into this brave new world of research collaboration at a time where it's a little more difficult these days. I remember when I was debating, we thought that Russia was a strong ally. They were becoming a good friend to the United States. And now we're looking into Ukraine thinking maybe that wasn't quite right. And that creates some new policy challenges that we have to address in terms of what happens when yesterday's friends become tomorrow's enemies. And is that something that we need to evaluate in terms of our policy consideration for research?
Right. Speaking of those kind of challenges, that gets me thinking about the harms of the current system, right? Something that we always talk about in policy debate. What kind of harms do you see out there that people are talking about with the way things are right now?
So part of it comes down to how are we going to ensure that we're protected in terms of allowing other people to come into the United States to research, particularly in the STEM area, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Those are sensitive areas because they relate to a variety of different topics, ranging from cybersecurity networks to advanced weapons technology to medical research. So it creates this question of how do we manage bringing people into the United States, and creates some struggles in terms of figuring out how do we actually still bring people in while still keeping what we have secure.
Okay, great. I see a question from Chad. He asks, what power is the US given to begin research collaborations?
So when it comes to setting up research collaboration, part of this will take place through the various public policy agencies. As I was saying before, you have the Department of Energy and Department of Health and Human Services who develop regulations to decide, hey, how are we going to work together here? What policies are we going to set in the regulatory code? Sometimes Congress may get involved. You have the Foreign Agents Registration Act that I believe was developed under the Roosevelt era. But I think there will probably be a little more focus in terms of how are we going to have a regulatory body that addresses these particular questions, maybe more so than Congress. There's also, as I was mentioning, some legislation that's available, but there's several different channels that can be taken in that case. And it's quite a broad topic that will cover quite a few different areas that the United States has some relevance in.
Okay, great. What do you see out there in terms of proposed solutions that people are talking about to maybe remedy some of the problems or challenges that we're facing today?
Well, as I mentioned before, part of it is reforming how do we manage those who are present for STEM technology inside the United States, allowing them to work on certain projects, allowing them to be connected to certain areas here. I've been having some technical difficulties. So I've been trying to pull up some of the lists I have in the background here. The computer's restarted about 3 times during this conversation here.
Okay, I totally understand. Let me ask you this. This resolution, we want to talk about the broadness of each one. Mm-hmm. And the broadness of this resolution, I think, is that it could include any country in the world. Mm-hmm. How is that tempered by this resolution area? Do you think it's too broad because it includes all the countries in the world?
Generally, no. There's always a risk that the topic may be too expansive, but I think in this case, there's going to be some large players we're going to be really concerned about. We're going to be most concerned about China because China has some international espionage going on, and we're always a little concerned about what they have their finger in at a given moment. So I think that's going to probably take up a major role in terms of the security aspect. I think that we'd be able to see more interaction when it comes to Europe or other nations that we typically have, as I will describe, a technological parity with, where we're kind of on an even footing where we're able to supply resources. And then there would be a general third category of maybe assisting a nation who is not at the same technological level as the United States is, helping to build further that particular relationship. So I think there are general categories of cases that will exist that will help limit. So there won't be too many squirrel cases. I know there's, I'm trying to remember how many nations there are in the world, but you're not going to have really 192 sufficiently distinct cases.
Right, that makes sense. Great. What kind of fields of study are addressed under this resolution? In what fields do we see international collaboration on research?
Sure. Just even going off of recent examples here, taking a look at what happened during the COVID-19 virus. There was an international effort to develop a vaccine that would help to alleviate some of the issues present there. So we see it in the biomedical industry. We also see it within the weapons industry, where we're attempting to work with other nations to develop our weapons technology to make sure that we're safe at home and abroad.
Right. Okay, great. I saw a question come through about how this resolution might corroborate or collaborate with the LD resolutions. Of course, we don't know yet which LD resolution is going to be chosen. So it's hard to say. I have looked at all 6 of the proposed resolutions on both sides. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but I don't see really a lot of crossover between the policy resolutions and the value resolutions if you've looked at those. Do you see any?
Unfortunately, I haven't had as much time to look over the LD resolutions. It's been a little busy trying to get the wedding plan since it's coming up so soon here.
That's right.
But even generally then, I mean, even during my time in debate, even when there's crossover, the subjects are distinct enough that it's not going to be the same topic, because there's also just a completely different focus between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions coming through on this one, but at the end, if you guys have thought of a question that you really want to get answered on this particular resolution, we can come back around to it if we have time at the end. But for now, I'm going to move on to policy resolution number 2, which is the United States. Oh, actually, before I read this, I should say the committee has been continuing to work on this resolution in particular, and we have already decided to change this wording just a little bit. So let me give you the new wording that we are currently using right now, and I'll explain why we've done that. So the current wording, and this will be on the website and everything, and we will release it in print. This is what we have changed it to. The United States federal government should significantly reform its import and/or export policy. So it previously said significantly reform its policy toward import and/or export regulations. And as we looked at that further, the interaction of the words policy and regulations, we realized, I won't go into all the detail, but we realized that we were limiting the resolution in a way we didn't want to limit it. And so by taking out regulations from there and just saying the United States should reform its import or export policy, this allows the affirmative team to address import or export through law or through regulation. So through congressional laws, right, that are passed through Congress and then signed by the president, or through the bureaucratic agencies and their regulations that they enact. So this new wording allows affirmatives to reform either laws or regulations just by actually simplifying the wording and using only policy there. So if you have any questions about that, of course you can ask. Emma was the lead researcher on this one. So Emma, let me ask you about this one. What are the key issues at the heart of this resolution?
At the heart of this resolution is mostly teaching debaters what different things about trade and imports and exports and how the US governs that, specifically through the lens of preserving national security, through advancing the US's economic growth, or even the growth of other countries, and overall promoting international relationships.
Great. Can you dig into import-export policy for us a little bit? Tell us about what pieces are involved there.
Right. So import and export policy is a bit difficult to define. As I was researching, just to be honest, it can be a difficult topic to research. However, it can be simplified a little bit. So it's about promoting and controlling exports and imports. And exports and imports are broad, since they are any goods or services which are imported or exported between two countries, which the majority of the time refers to buying and selling between nations. The overwhelming majority of the time, it has to do with merchandise or services, which is usually what laws refer to as goods and services, passing through the borders. So through legal ports of entry. How are those goods handled? What licenses may people have to acquire? And how are they shipped? What happens when they arrive? What are the different countries' regulations in regards to imports and exports, and how do we interact? Stuff like that. But import and export laws, oh, sorry, you can go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to clarify that import and export law currently does not apply to all goods that pass through the borders. While goods can be considered an import or export just by the fact that they cross the border through a port of entry, 95% of items that are exported or imported do not need a license at all. The US government doesn't regulate it. This resolution does not allow the affirmative team to regulate everything that might eventually leave or enter the United States. The affirmative team can only pass plans about the act of importing or exporting, which items need to be controlled, or which countries the US will place either special exporting preferences or place sanctions upon.
Okay, yeah, that gets to what I was going to ask, which is how does the United States use its import-export policy in international relations?
That's right. So some of the import policy in particular are things that are in the news a lot, talked among academics a lot, like tariffs, quotas, sanctions, embargoes. Basically, all of those are trade controls that are handled by agencies that deal with import policy. So tariffs specifically are a special tax on imported goods from specific countries, and that's supposed to help US domestic goods. That's the idea, although there is a big argument on whether tariffs are even helpful. Quotas are the similar idea, where we're trying to help domestic goods by limiting the amount, that if there's a specific quota on how many imports we take in. Sanctions are placed on different nations for national security reasons or international relations reasons, where we decide not to either import or export with them. And embargoes are sort of similar. It's a sort of sanction that we place on a specific country for international policy reasons.
Okay, great. So I have a question from Matthew about what kind of a plan the affirmative can run. Can the affirmative plan run a plan which would, say, increase the penalty for smuggling?
I think that might apply. I know that Customs and Border Control is the enforcement agency that would look at smuggling, but I'm not specifically sure. My guess would be Customs and Border Control would be the agency that deals with smuggling, so then it would fall under the affirmative plan.
Okay. He also had a question about the white paper, the section titled Parameters of the Resolution, and how that's meant to be used. I'm going to guess that question gets to, is the white paper kind of like defining and limiting the resolution, or what's the purpose there?
The white paper was the initial rundown of the topic to give people a nice broad overview of what this topic could look like. However, it's not necessarily supposed to be referenced by debaters and then brought into the debate round to say this is exactly what debaters can or cannot argue about. However, I know that this is something we've been discussing. We might, for this resolution specifically, have to put out a paragraph or two with specific parameters after we've researched this topic more fully, because of the technicality of this kind of topic.
Yes, but just to clarify, the white paper is not an official statement by NCFCA limiting the resolution. It's just for information purposes. Bree has a question. Can you provide an example of a situation where an affirmative plan might be extra topical, even though it deals with goods and services?
Right. So not all goods and services are exports or imports. A good or a service becomes an export or import when it is in transit between the US and a foreign country, either originating in a foreign country and then ending in the US, originating in a foreign country and passing through the US, or originating in the US and then ending in a foreign country. In that time frame is when it's an export or an import. So an example, I think, of an extra topical plan, which is something that I put in the white paper, was, let's say we want the US to be able to export more oil and then not have to import as much oil. So the affirmative plan is to build an oil pipeline to get more oil. The specific regulations and agency that would deal with building an oil pipeline are not the same agencies that deal with import and export regulations. It sort of has a peripheral impact on how much oil the US exports, but it is not related specifically with export policy.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the broadness of the resolution and the overlap with the other two policy areas. So this resolution area actually does overlap a little bit with both of the other two. And I'd love for you to explain kind of that overlap, but in doing so, also explain its uniqueness. Where is it unique from the other two as well?
Right. So with the Africa resolution, it can only overlap with the Africa resolution in a narrower way. For example, if the affirmative team wanted to provide aid to an African country specifically by setting up a preference program or giving them export credits, those are the only two export policy related aid programs that the affirmative team could pursue. A preference program is basically ignoring the different tariffs and quotas that we normally have on items and opening our markets to be more free to a specific country if we want to help them grow a little bit quicker. And export credits are sort of similar, but they're sort of like a grant, some money to specifically help that other country with exporting their goods.
Okay. And then how about any overlap with the international research?
Right. So for the international research cooperation, there is potential for more overlap here than with the African resolution overlap, since certain international research cooperation is actually called a deemed export. So basically, the US government has deemed an export any research that gets released to a foreign national that has a military application or could be co-opted to have a military application. This has happened for national security reasons. And I think this gets at to what Jonathan was talking about, where the United States really has little infrastructure around this new age of information. So what they've had to do is sort of deem certain research as an export to find a regulatory body that could handle it. So basically, if you want to do certain kinds of research with people from a foreign nation, then you have to apply for an export license with the relevant export agency.
All right. You've mentioned agencies several times and like which agency would be over which kind of policy. And Matthew is asking, is this resolution intended to define topicality on the basis of what agency would enforce the plan?
Yes, that is sort of the intention. However, if an affirmative plan wants to create an agency or get rid of an agency or merge agencies, then that could be something that the affirmative team could do. However, that is the lens by which I was able to understand how import and export policy works. If a law related to import policy or export policy is passed by Congress, it then gets relegated to the relevant agency. And there are multiple different agencies that handle it, but that would be the recommended lens that I would use to look at which agencies deal with import and export regulations.
I would agree, having looked at some of the legal code and the regulations, the code itself names the agencies when it's kind of defining these policies. I have some questions about the politics of this resolution, which I'll get to in a minute. But first I want to talk about, this is a pretty broad topic, but what do you see as limiting factors on this resolution that kind of keep it without getting too broad?
Well, I think that some natural limiters are the fact that this is a technical issue. So no one's going to be able to become an expert on imports and exports in just a season. So then that means that a lot of the initial research is going to be spent on trying to get to know the topic and figuring out which agencies are involved. And then also another natural limiter is the fact that there are only certain hot topics related to imports and exports. So while it may seem a bit like a very broad topic that it has to do with all goods that pass through the border, there are only a few areas which are actually debatable areas, I would say, or readily, easily researched. So I think that's the natural limiter on this topic.
Okay, great. Speaking of those hot topics, we have been using sanctions against Russia currently in the war with Ukraine. And I have a question from Jimmy that I think captures a few of the questions about the politics of this resolution, which is, do you believe that the negative team may be especially disadvantaged due to the current events of just like affirmative being able to run a case saying, let's ban this import or export from or to Russia because we need to stand up for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that there could be a lot of weight on the side of affirmative if they wanted to talk about Russia in particular and the war that's going on. But the limiter specifically for neg this year will be, does the affirmative team have advocacy on their side? Because we could come up with a lot of good ideas, and maybe we don't like Russia and what they're doing. Maybe we don't like China and what they're doing. Hey, sanctions are a thing, let's just pass sanctions. But are advocates actually wanting this? And can the negative team find advocacy against it? I think advocacy will be the main point of debate between the affirmative and the negative team. And I also, like I said, a natural limiter, because while you may be able to come up with lots of ideas in a resolution this broad, there won't be as much advocacy for niche ideas.
True. I also think solvency and disadvantages come into play where, I mean, it's debatable how well sanctions work. It's the disadvantages of cutting off trade completely to our own country and our own economic well-being. I mean, these are the real world issues that people are debating right now. Definitely. So it's definitely not a cut and dry situation here. Let's see, are there any more questions on this one? I think I will go ahead and move to our third topic. Thank you for all your questions there. And thank you, Emma. So our third policy resolution for you to consider is one I'm really excited about. And I'm going to come to Cheryl Edwards to talk about resolved the United States federal government should substantially increase economic assistance to one or more countries in Eastern or Southern Africa as defined by the United Nations GEO scheme. And I won't read all the countries, but you hopefully saw that we do have the actual list of all the countries in that GEO scheme. So the boundaries of the resolution are very clearly defined about which countries we're talking about here. What are the key issues at the heart of this resolution, Cheryl?
Well, I would say that it really has to do with, everyone pretty much agrees that Africa needs help. What is help? You know, what is really helping, what is really not helping, and then how is that most effectively delivered? And those are the big issues here, how to help. Now, if you break that down a little bit, yes, we've got different areas like national security, economic growth, democratic governance, international relationships, you know, and some of the classic types of relief that we are thinking about, because yes, there's still huge challenges in Africa.
Great. Matthew asks a great question. Why did the committee narrow down the resolution to Eastern and Southern Africa instead of all of Africa?
Well, Africa is really, really big, and I think I read something somewhere, and it's very imprecise memory, but it's basically like it's as big as the U.S. and Europe combined, or some kind of thing. It's just enormous, and so a lot of the northern African states are tied up with some of the Middle East stuff, which we have done plenty of that. And then the Western Africa, some of those nations are not in relatively quite as tough a shape as some of the Eastern and Southern. And so that's why we were looking at those regions particularly.
Yes. And also talk about some of the other language in this resolution that you think narrows and focuses this resolution so that it's not too broad.
Oh, absolutely. So there's two specific limiters for this resolution, and they are, back to my notes here. We are specifically saying that you need to substantially increase aid, and we are specifying economic aid. About 30% of aid that's provided to countries in Africa is military assistance. And so I know I've heard some rumblings about people thinking, oh, well, all of the resolutions are economic ones this year. In this particular resolution, we really mean economic as opposed to military. And just because we have done plenty of Middle East and international terrorism stuff, we don't necessarily want to get there again because, international terrorism was only 4 years ago. We don't want to repeat that. So economic means other kinds of foreign aid that are not military.
Perfect. Can you elaborate a bit on what that economic assistance, what that aid entails?
Well, there's different ways that different agencies categorize it. And basically, I think it's easier to talk about the strategic objectives. And I did put this in the white paper, but, peace and security. And in this instance, non-military security, which is kind of a really small percentage, but it is legitimate. And investing in people, things like education, specifically of women and children, and some of those kinds of things, governing justly and democratically, economic growth, and humanitarian assistance. And I think those are helpful ways to think about it.
Okay. Would this include medical aid? I know we have a lot of programs for
Yes.
dealing with disease and all of that. Would you think that falls under economic assistance?
It probably actually falls under humanitarian assistance. There's been a lot of COVID-19 and AIDS and malaria type of initiatives. And in fact, that actually health-related aid makes up a large percentage of the humanitarian assistance that we're giving right now. I can't remember the percentage specifically, but the number 75% is rolling around in my head.
Okay, great. Jeremiah has a question for you about solvency. He says his initial reaction is that corruption may make solvency extremely difficult to prove. In other words, the corruption on the other side in the country in Africa, how are affirmatives going to prove that their assistance is going to help?
Absolutely. Corruption is definitely going to be a negative space, where they're going to have opportunity to develop briefs on corruption. And of course, that kind of is a little bit a specific strand of the how I was mentioning earlier, because, that's part of trying to make it effective is to make sure that it doesn't end up in the wrong place or with the wrong people. And that is definitely a concern. And we're trying to, provide aid smarter, not harder.
Okay. Yeah. So something for the affirmative to think about in the delivery of it, how to prevent corruption.
Yes, very much so.
Great. There's a question here from Bree who asks, would there be a limitation to NGO engagement with the federal government when policy changes are considered for this resolution? How does it affect NGOs, I guess?
So NGOs are often selected as the delivery mechanism, particularly in countries where there is a tremendous amount of corruption. And so I do not see that being changed by the resolution. I think that's still a legitimate delivery method. It would still be the government providing the funds through an NGO, and that would be the same as it is now.
Okay, great. Of course, I guess that could be a topic area that if affirmatives wanted to change that, they could.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
It sounded like there was a clarification that somebody was wondering if humanitarian aid is different than economic aid.
Yes.
Humanitarian aid is a subsection, so it's one of the subcategories underneath the broad economic aid concept. Again, economic as opposed to military.
Okay, I was wrong. I interpreted you wrong, and I'm glad that you clarified that and we followed that up. So ignore my comment in the chat. Okay, so humanitarian aid is a subset of economic aid.
Correct.
Got it. So you would see aid, foreign aid, as split into two big groups, military, economic.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. That's great. So what kind of issues is this resolution trying to address? Where do you see potential affirmative case areas?
So there are going to be different affirmative case areas, and I think that some of the big ones could be, there's a lot of people that have been saying, hey, we need to do more than just the health stuff, but still that's the lion's share of what we're doing. I think there's a lot of room for growth in education initiatives. I think there's a lot of room for growth in democratic governance, and later if people want to break down a little bit more what that means, we could do that. I also think that agriculture is another big one. And I know that we think, oh, Africa is the desert. Well, there's quite a bit of desert, clearly, but that's not all of Africa. And so yes, there is agricultural initiatives that could probably be super helpful.
Great, thank you, Cheryl. Matthew is asking about, should economic as opposed to military phrasing be included in the resolution? I'm sure you thought of that already, but we'll just take that under advisement under the category of wording suggestions, and we won't answer that live, but you have spoken to the committee, so they can consider it. Matthew.
I actually could answer that pretty quick.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So it says substantially increase economic assistance. So that's actually been handled.
Okay, so there's a definition, I assume, out there of economic assistance that makes that very clear.
Yes, and that's footnoted in the paper.
Perfect. All right, so let's refer you to the white paper then, and you can find that out and see those definitions. Great. Jimmy asks, could an affirmative team argue that military aid in some cases is a part of economic assistance because military aid will lead to a better economy? Or I could also think of, we need to do the military part to fix the corruption and make the economic effective.
So the only kind of quasi type of aid that would be eligible is non-military security assistance. And again, that's a teeny tiny sliver, but the way that the US government has set up foreign aid, there's a pretty clear bright line between economic and military.
Okay, which that seems like it answers Matthew's follow-up about feeling nervous that this could be a lot of definitional debates about the type of aid. But you're saying you're finding in the literature, it's a pretty clear line. The government has defined it pretty clearly between military aid and economic aid.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. The white paper, says Chad, mentioned a lack of congressional advocacy. Could you explain how that will affect the narrowness of AF cases?
So you've basically hit on a key point here. If there's a major weakness that I've seen, it has been struggling to find enough viable affirmative cases in the current structure of the resolution. And that's actually caused me, to kind of pull out my almost gone hair already a little bit. I love this whole idea of Africa, but finding viable case ideas is, I think, a little bit of a challenge. And there's definitely not, I don't think there's going to be like, hey, here's this bill that people have already proposed in Congress, which is always kind of nice when you can find those. This is a year where you're not going to see a lot of those, so it's going to be a little bit interesting.
So advocates are more likely to be NGOs, humanitarian organizations and such like that.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, great. That's good to clarify. All right, well, we are coming towards the end of our time, so I will just take maybe one or two more questions on any of the topics. I see a question right here that I'll answer very quickly. What is an NGO? It is a non-governmental organization. So those include like nonprofits and advocacy groups. They work a lot. So the Red Cross, for example, is an NGO. But any other questions as we finish out this very informative session on any of the three resolutions? Okay, there's a question under the first resolution coming back to Jonathan. Let me go. All right. Jonathan, do you anticipate any political bias with tariffs in this resolution?
I mean, I'm one of the weird nerds who has friends who will debate tariffs all throughout the day. Usually tariffs pop up more when you're dealing with directly trading specific items. In this case, we're really not talking about specific items. We're talking about what are we going to allow people to deal with intangible information. So it's getting to the intellectual property question. So I don't know that tariffs are really going to be as much of a major play here, but even if they are, I mean, that's also going to come down to how are you going to speak to your judge at that point? Because if there is an internal bias, that's something that's inherent within all debate with any communication. I practice as an attorney, and I know that there are some times where people have a bias towards one way or another on a case I'm working on. So you just have to work to overcome it and figure out how to do that.
Okay. Same question for you, Emma, with your resolution. What do you think about tariffs and political bias?
I think that the tariffs question is actually a really fun debate to get into, because while it does seem like the economists are out here arguing for free trade is the best thing for global growth, and so any kind of trade control like tariff is bad. That's what the economists will say. However, the politicians will say, yes, but trade controls are necessary when we're getting into international relations and national security and other things like that. So I actually think that would be a fun tension to debate between what are the costs and the benefits of achieving political goals versus economic goals when it comes to tariffs and other trade controls.
Great, thank you. And I'll give you the final question, Cheryl. Susie asks, and another person is echoing this question. Do you think that the lack of congressional advocacy could turn out to be a good thing by encouraging debaters to think of their own unique solutions instead of just bringing up a proposed bill?
Absolutely, it definitely could. So, but if this is a resolution that that is chosen, then people would need to, consider arguing that differently. So absolutely, because then we'd be like, well, who's your advocate? I mean, it's not going to be quite that much of a year if we do that.
Right, exactly. Okay, but I think, saying the Red Cross is our advocate is a great advocate.
Oh, absolutely.
Side, right? Yeah, absolutely. All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. If you have further questions or comments about this year's policy resolutions, please feel free to write to the debate committee. We will get your emails, debatecommittee@ncfca.org. And don't forget to vote, of course. You can visit your NCFCA dashboard. In the blue bar at the top of the screen, you're going to click on the survey, and then you will use that survey to rank your resolutions. We do ranked voting. So first, second, and third place for your family choice by April 18th by midnight Central Time. And if you would like to stay tuned, we will start the value debate live Q&A with the members of the value debate resolution committee here in about 8 minutes. So thank you all. Thank you, Emma and Jonathan and Cheryl. I really appreciated talking with you tonight. Thank you so much for your hard work and research and for all the time you've put in to help our debaters have a great season in 2023.